Good evening. My name's Professor Anna-Marie Jargos. I'm the head of the School of Literature, Art and Media down the road at the University of Sydney. We're here this evening, welcome all of you, to hear Dr. Sheridan Palmer speak about her biography of the acclaimed Australian art historian Bernard Smith. Sheridan, I learned some of these autobiographical tidbits in our conversation before this evening. Sheridan, in fact, trained as an artist herself. She's been an art dealer and an art curator, and only more recently trod the scholarly path, training as an art historian. She was chosen by Bernard Smith in the late years of his life to write his biography, and I think for those of us who've read this work, she repays Smith's confidence handsomely with a smart, engaging, and often beautifully written account of Smith's life. Sheridan's Hegel's Owl, The Life of Bernard Smith, has been published by the University of Sydney's Power Publications. Some of you might know that Power Publications was established 30 years ago in 1986, and it has across the last several years been refreshed and revitalised with a fresh energy for meeting its commitment to making available at affordable prices to wide audiences great writing on contemporary art and theory in the broadest sense. So it's very appropriate that Hegel's Owl, a work some years in the making, comes out under the Power Publications imprint. For Bernard Smith, as Sheridan's biography recounts, was of course the inaugural director of the Power Institute of Fine Arts and the Power Professor of Contemporary Art for the first decade of the controversial establishment of the Power and the teaching of art history at the University of Sydney. And if Bernard Smith is appropriately most well known as a giant scholar, he equally played, as Sheridan's biography also captures, a formidable role here in Glebe, where he lived, leading the successful opposition to a massive freeway that was planned for our area. Sound familiar? A clear case of history repeating, I think. Sheridan's biography has been widely praised for its deft handling of a massive archive of materials, for its ability to describe broad historical contexts while also sketching in many memorable small details, for its capacity to make persuasive connections between Smith's life experience and his scholarly theorisations. Ian Donaldson, for example, reviewing Hegel's Owl for the ABR, described it as a generously spirited biography. And if you haven't read it already, I urge you to do so. Please welcome Sheridan.
A bit shorter, so can everybody hear me adequately? Thank you for coming this evening. My lecture or talk is titled Biographies nach Leben, or Bernard Smith's Afterlife. Biography is a kind of history. Once it's written, it memorialises the individual in time and place. The subject not only possesses an enduring afterlife, but the genre is implicit, an implicit midwife to his or her transition. Of course, some subjects and some biographies, like any historical figure, last better than others. And turning to Bernard Smith, our exemplary art historian, we find a magnificent example of a towering figure in the discipline of cultural history, ranked during his lifetime as the father of Australian art history, and thus already preserved in the patriarchal canon. But what put him ahead in his field? Smith spent much of his life understanding what it was to be Antipodean, to think Antipodean and to resituate it politically, culturally, and aesthetically. Identity mattered to Smith, both his own and Australia's, and I will say more shortly about that. Smith's work is also continually used and rehabilitated. For 70 years, he exerted pressure on generations of art and cultural historians to define their ideas. But it was his brilliant idea of antipodal inversion, in that you need two opposite contrasting points on the globe to define one another, and in his case, it was Europe and Australia. And this enabled him to articulate Australia's modern cultural evolution and identity. Now, this idea of cultural inversion sprang largely from his meeting with exiled European scholars in Sydney in 1940, refugee art historians from Hitler's Europe, who dramatically expanded his knowledge of world art. But they also taught him about cultural diffusion, the centre and its peripheries, and how movement of human traffic and culture affects both. And culture, as we know, is a complex set of intersecting values, and Bernard Smith engaged effectively across several disciplines, including the socio-political. And indeed, one artist called him, and very justifiably, a politician of the arts. Smith was a Marxist from the age of 20 until the end of his life. The Spanish Civil War and fascism had profoundly affected him, and he took Picasso's Guernica as a timeless, iconic symbol of political unrest and protest. During the 1940s, he rose rapidly as a critic of art and society. Art, he wrote, should reflect society. At the same time, he met and married Kate Challis, who was not only a cultured middle-class Englishwoman, but as Bernard openly acknowledged, she was his civilising influence. She also helped his cultural ascendancy. Indeed, one might ask whether Bernard would have made it to where he did if it hadn't been for Kate. And it was something that I very much wanted to try and build into the biography, a greater and more in-depth view and understanding of Kate. And yet, in the end, it just wasn't going to work. But I think probably what I say about Kate indicates the strength of the woman. Now, unable to study at a university because he did not possess a foreign language, and we're going back into the 1930s, Bernard eventually enrolled part-time at the University of Sydney in 1946 through the Commonwealth Education Reconstruction Training Program known as CERTS, as did so many returned servicemen. And though Bernard was never mobilised, he had trained in the army. He had, however, already proven his intellectual credentials. The previous year, in 1945, his first book, Place, Taste and Tradition, was published. And the year before that, he had commenced as an education officer and a de facto curator at the National Art Gallery of Sydney. It was there that, as a working-class communist, Smith endured insidious discrimination from conservative trustees who treated the gallery like an elite gentleman's club and Bernard like their enemy. As he said, it is privilege and politics that separates human beings. Just let me read from Hegel's Owl. This will give you an idea of the discrimination that he experienced. From the outset, Bernard's movement into the gallery had been highly political in an art political sense, not only because he was a communist, but also because he was a modernist. Paranoid that communism was infiltrating their hallowed institution, right-wing trustees such as Lionel Lindsay, John Maund and James McGregor were subversively antagonistic towards Bernard. But as he said, he developed strategies of sidestepping their opposition, and he never argued with any of them on aesthetic grounds, but simply in liberal terms. With none of the redeeming lunacy of his brother Norman, Lionel Lindsay, while appealing cordial enough to Bernard in the corridors, ranted to his friends and to his brother Darrell Lindsay, who was at the time the director of the National Gallery of Victoria, "May the gods destroy him." When Bernard, George Berger, Ralph Fazell, Sally Herman and Ian Fairweather applied for the position of director of the gallery in 1945, Lionel Lindsay wrote, a quote, that Como Smith and his refo friend the swine, Dr. Berger, were nothing but political and racial vermin, end of quote. In 1948, Smith was awarded a British Council scholarship to study at the Courtauld Institute, where the director, Anthony Blunt, the famous undercover agent, sent him across to the Warburg Institute with its émigré scholars. Bernard was infinitely more comfortable with these foreigners than staying at the elite Courtauld Institute, where even at his first meeting with Blunt, he was offended by the Englishman's condescending manner. The 2 years in England was life-changing for Smith, and it transformed him into a cosmopolitan Antipodean. Importantly, it gave him the critical distance to understand Australia more objectively. His brilliant essay, European Vision and the South Pacific, published in this was the essay that he wrote, which was a result of the 2 years of his study and research in London. Produced from this period, compared the origins of art in Australia with British traditional values of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A decade later, brilliantly expanded by postdoctoral research at the newly established Australian National University and published under the same title, it established his reputation as a pioneering scholar in the new field of Pacific studies, British imperialism, and how cultural traffic created innovative ways of seeing. By 1956, Smith had joined the Fine Arts Department at the University of Melbourne, working with Joseph Burke, Franz Philipp, and Ursula Hoff, the 3 European art historians who had established art history as an academic discipline in Australia. Now, jumping forward to Bernard Smith's Power Institute decade, 1967 to 1977, and I won't go into the trials and tribulations he experienced as the Power Professor, recounted in the biography, but I will say that it was a period fraught, and maybe fraught is perhaps even too soft a word, by antagonistic professional relationships and excessive tensions. What I want to talk about is Bernard's other major activity as a social and urban activist here in Glebe. And this is what I say in Hegel's Owl. As Kate and Bernard got to know their neighbourhood, Kate's passion for its architecture and preservation of the buildings developed into a serious research project and conservation program. From middle-class Glebe Point to the less privileged areas of Bishopthorpe, also in Glebe, and other areas closer to the city, many houses were in appalling condition. But far from being a slum suburb, as the town planning department suggested, they found, that is, Kate and Bernard found its working class ambience appealing. Its earthy friendliness and lack of pretense, as Max Solling has described, was exactly their sort of place. Theft, however, was prevalent, and after their magnificent ceramic Angel Learning to Walk by John Percival was stolen, bought from Percival's 1958 exhibition for 80 guineas, Kate and Bernard kept an old broken sofa and refrigerator on their veranda to deter further burglaries. The Glebe community had always been a mixture of students, professionals, and tradespeople, but when the Askin government began tearing down houses to make way for a massive freeway, the people galvanised. Under Kate and Bernard's leadership, they established the Glebe Society, and while Bernard was an effective leader and spokesman who relished the opportunity to resist bureaucrats and take to the streets with public protests, Kate was the driving force. The Society played a crucial role in the Whitlam government's decision to purchase 42 acres, 17 hectares, of Bishopsthorpe, which, according to Bernard, was the first piece of urban conservation undertaken in Australia. As Bernard's son John said, "A bulldozer was no match for Bernard, as many of us have found when we tried to stop him from doing something that he had set his mind to." So how did I come to write Bernard Smith's biography? His invitation came when I visited him in 2008, after he had read my book, Centre for the Proofread. I had a subchapter on him, which he admired. Intending to write something on the influence of European scholarship on his intellectual development, I realised that, like the exiled art historians he had mixed with in the 1940s, Bernard was a social outsider. He could stand at the edge of society and see it for what it was, and that type of autonomy also provided a greater freedom of expression. More to the point, how could I have declined Smith's offer to write his biography? I was extremely flattered, too flattered to decline, but equally anxious about such a colossal challenge. His historiography had set a benchmark, and moreover, anyone who holds a position of such authority tends to be judged by it, either positively or harshly. Smith's reputation in the world of art and cultural history was without peer in Australia, and I wondered how I could accommodate his extraordinary productivity and storehouse of ideas, whether I could do justice to the breadth and depth of his scholarship. I also realised that in writing his life story, I would be defining his reputation and by default be complicit in his posthumous Nachleben. But Bernard Smith knew that you need distance from the recent past, that you cannot see wholly and fully what has just taken place, and therefore he was not prepared to write his third and final autobiography. Someone else had to do the job. The American journalist Janet Malcolm considers autobiography, or the presentation of the self, as, and I quote, "an exercise in self-forgiveness. The observing eye of the autobiography tells the story of the observed eye, as a mother might. The older narrator looks back at his younger self with tenderness and pity, empathising with its sorrows and allowing for its sins." End of quote. Bernard Smith wasn't prepared to forgive certain people, and he did not want to write about his own failures, telling me, "Hide nothing, write about it all." Some revelations I would have enjoyed teasing out, but deadlines, financial restrictions, and the avoidance of litigation meant that I had to keep certain sensitive material under lock and key. The rest I balanced with fact with suggestiveness rather than outright accusation of naming victims or traitors. One has to navigate the contemporary terrain carefully. I was also curious about Smith's illegitimacy and how this had affected his life. His multiple award-winning autobiography, The Boy Deodatus, A Portrait of a Lucky Young Bastard, published in 1986, was an exceptional account of his humble origins and rite of passage from boyhood to young manhood. It was also a touching analysis of his place within society and a brilliant study of interwar Sydney. This is what I say in Hegel's Owl. Illegitimacy has a way of cloaking a child, for he was, for the most part, a filius nullius. But even there, Bernard had been lucky and escaped the usual destination of fostered children, many of whom were sent to farms that operated like 19th century workhouses. Instead, he became a favoured ward in what was called a farming outhouse. A farming outhouse. The winsome child who flourished as best he could under the circumstances set by the State Welfare Department of New South Wales. I know people who were born illegitimate. Some have used the poverty of their inheritance to their advantage. Others have been terribly hampered by, I've forgotten to give you the next photo of Bernard in Burwood as a little ward, state ward. Others have been terribly hampered by the blank space in their origins. Bernard, however, established from a very young age clear points of reference about his bastardry and understood boundaries and how to overcome them. Being in the margins of society, he could observe how those who wielded power operated. The silence of his ancestors may have compounded his sense of identity, sometimes savagely. No, he's not one of us, his foster sister told a door salesman. And for Bernard, that hurt deeply. To know that, he said, was to know everything. Now, I recently gave a talk just last week at the Lyceum Club in Melbourne where a woman told me she'd grown up very close to where Bernard had lived in a farming outhouse. She remembered a number of farming outhouses close by that had often up to 15 state wards. Children nobody would or could play with and who were considered tainted, contaminated. Children discriminated and isolated by their birth. Now, I think Bernard carried some pretty heavy baggage from his childhood. And the cultural historian Julia Kristeva has written that, I quote, "When others convey to you that you are of no or little account because you are an orphan, then the weight of that obscurity crushes. What fragile pride is left?" Bernard refused to be crushed. He also wrote, "Poverty is a hard teacher." And in a letter to Vincent Buckley, this is Bernard's foster mother, Mrs. Keane, and her very silent husband, actually. He rarely spoke. Bertha Keane, Bernard here, and 4 more state wards. And Bernard had been left with Mrs. Keane at the age of 6 months, sleeping in her bed until he was old enough to be moved into Pa Keane's bed. And then after that, to the veranda where he slept with another, sometimes I think at one stage it was up to 10 state wards. In a letter to Vincent Buckley, in 1984, Bernard explained that, and I quote, "Many illegitimate children who do not succumb to self-pity experience a kind of distancing from society. One sees oneself almost as a kind of witness figure." This acute sense of not belonging profoundly shaped Bernard Smith, and the foundation of his character was deeply formed by resilience to society, to others, but never to himself. And this is the heroic aspect of Smith's life and how he turned his poverty of inheritance to his advantage. The German philosopher Hegel wrote, I quote, the Owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. And old age, as Ian Donaldson suggests in his Australian book review of my book, is the ultimate falling of the dusk. I saw Minerva's owl also as a metaphor for Bernard the historian, a man who believed that events are clarified through time and distance. In asking me to be his biographer, Bernard was role-playing Minerva's owl, a timely masterpiece in which he himself had grown old into the greyest of greys, where his life could not be rejuvenated but only understood. So what methodology did I use to construct Bernard Smith's life, a man who died just short of his 95th year, a magnificent scholar, a combative intellectual who wrote 15 major books on art, identity, and well before Edward Said, on cultural imperialism. An internationally recognised scholar of the art of Captain Cook's voyages and a prolific critic of art and society. Because his life was complex, I periodised his development as a narration of origins, growth and maturity, defined by the socio-political and cultural forces that moulded him. It was a life formed during the turmoil of the 1930s and 40s, when tradition and the atom were split and modernism ended with the Cold War. I also had to find the private person, the house where he was born in a basement room in Balmain on the 3rd of October 1916, to an unmarried Irish emigrant woman and an itinerant worker 30 years her senior. I wandered through the working class suburb of Burwood and found the house he'd grown up in as a state ward. I found the scent of courtship with his wife contained in crumpled letters, and the pace of his relentless research in hundreds of museums and galleries around the world, all unfolded in diaries and travel journals. I enjoyed being led along streets into cities and museums looking at beautiful drawings done by artists of the First Fleet or Cook's Voyages. And I found interviewing 80 colleagues, friends, and the odd foe rewarding. Through thousands of papers and letters with some of Australia's best game changers, all held in Smith's vast archive at the National Library in Canberra and the Mitchell Library here in Sydney, I sifted and pieced his life and journey together. And after 6 years of research and writing, I felt exhilarated and very privileged that I had accepted Bernard's offer. In his final book, The Formalesque, published in 2007, when he was 90, Bernard wrote, "Art history is a kind of biography. Its infrastructure is aesthetic. As a discipline, art history is about artists, and art is a reflection of society and the temper of the times. And given Bernard's profession, I thought an infrastructural aesthetic seemed appropriate. As he said, words are often forgotten, but images remain." I trained as a sculptor, where ideas and emotions are transformed into images and three-dimensional forms. I've always fused words to form sentences that have a visual quality, touchable, hard and soft, smooth and rough, creating the right information with nuanced modulations. I've worked in major galleries with paintings, prints and drawings and understand the power of the image as a visual historical information, images that can transcend time. This aesthetic training was very much to my advantage in dealing with an art historian of Bernard's calibre. His magisterial book, European Vision in the South Pacific, not only concerns European visual imagination in the Antipodes and the Enlightenment practice of art and science and how vision is shaped and coloured by what we know, it is also our cultural and traditional inheritance. Midway through writing his first autobiography, Bernard Smith was invited to give the ABC 1980 Boyer Lectures. Initially, he was going to talk about the legacy of his illegitimacy. But a colleague suggested that he transfer the tragedy of his personal separation to that of the loss of human dignity and dispossession encountered by Australia's Indigenous inhabitants. Bernard had always skirted around Aboriginality, primarily because his scholarship was based upon Western civilization, and he knew his limitations when addressing Aboriginal art and culture. He was neither an anthropologist nor was Aboriginal art terribly visible in the middle decades of the 20th century. This is what I say in Hegel's Owl. Australia's modern identity had developed under conditions of cultural displacement, geographical distance, as well as the repressive guilt associated with the locked cupboard of our history. In Smith's Boyer lectures, titled The Spectre of Truganini, he dealt with the great Australian silence, and it marked his cultural activism in Indigenous rights. Invoking the colonial crime of Indigenous genocide and the present as having potential for redemptive atonement and liberation, Smith took the moral high ground and brought the past into the present by quoting the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When W.H. Stanner gave his Boyer lectures in 1969, the dialogue on racial relations had moved to a new confrontational level, in which the hidden skeletons of the past were brought out into the white Australian conscience. But it was not until the Redfern Aborigines human and cultural rights protests in Sydney in the early 1970s and Gough Whitlam's establishment of a Department of Aboriginal Affairs and his landmark gesture of pouring sand into the Gringy elder's hand that Bernard saw the urgent need for Indigenous cultural recognition. It had taken him a long time to arrive confidently at the Aboriginal frontier and its moral and aesthetic territory. And he expressed this by gathering up the human condition with its culture of forgetfulness and putting universal justice on trial. I quote Bernard, "Between our history and our prehistory, between our Eden and the expulsion of 1788, lies a lawless terrain in which our courts stumble. We have been caught out, as it were, red-handed playing the genocide game, corrupting Darwinism for our purposes as the Nazis corrupted Nietzsche and Stalin corrupted Marx." Bernard's words transmitted accusation and verdict, the crime and blame to be collectively shared, and its effect on listeners was moving. When I was working on Smith's archive at the National Library of Australia, I received a phone call from a woman who found that I was writing Smith's biography. She excitedly told me that Bernard's Boyer lectures had changed her life. So moved had she been by Smith that she travelled to Indigenous settlements in northern Australia. Subsequently, she established the Kimberley Foundation, which protects and preserves Aboriginal cave art. Now that positively reinforces Bernard's Nachleben. In 1989, Bernard's wife, Kate, died, and his memorial to her was the establishment of the Raka Award, Australia's richest Indigenous prize for creative expression. Raka means 5 fingers, and Bernard felt this could represent the 5 artistic disciplines envisaged as a cyclic prize, with painting, film, non-fiction, poetry, and theatre awarded on a rotational basis. These 5 genres use word and image as information, an explicit part of art history. Raka memorialises Bernard, again functioning as his Nachleben. In a recent London Review of Book, John Lancaster wrote that geography is destiny. Bernard Smith kept pressing the idea of what it meant to be provincial and where one stood geographically and culturally in the world, even in the postmodern digital world where centres and provincialism keep shifting. Where one stands matters. His persistent interrogation of local and global power, class, populism or propaganda, and elitism pushed cultural and political boundaries. To be geographically remote did not mean to be intellectually removed. As Bernard said, distance is our longue durée, the near constant factor in our history that does so much to transform our art. And if we are creative and intelligent, we can put it to our advantage. As a participant historian, Bernard, and this is what made Bernard Smith so exciting, he staked his reputation and ideas on the page and in the public forum. Visibility and readability mattered to him. By using himself as both object and subject, especially evident in his 2002 Archibald portrait, he was a critical vector intent on intervening to shape our perceptions. This is what I say about this portrait in Hegel's Owl. Being portrayed naked would be his final sacrifice for art history, the Archibald being one of the most accessible public forms available for broader appreciation, as well as provide, one last time, an opportunity to revive his activism in the contemporary art world. He also had other motives which he intended to address, such as ageism and sexism. By using himself as the object-subject, Bernard hoped he might move the viewer into a stronger aesthetic response about figurative art, painting and portraiture. Devising a symbolic construction for his outer and inner psychological and human condition was important, but equally, he always believed in unadorned reality. Whether a gardener or a God professor, men are made of the same material and form. It is privilege and politics that separate them. Many people were shocked at Bernard Smith's brazen pose, modelled on a 2nd century BC classical sculpture called the Barberini Faun. And I say a lot about the hidden iconography in the biography. But parody is also loaded with a subverted afterlife, and in this respect, Bernard's Archibald portrait is an allegorical riposte of the emperor with no clothes, the father of Australian art history, giving his last inescapable lesson aimed at the crisis of representation and identity in the postmodern age. As Terry Smith says, Bernard was intent on changing the world as much as interpreting it. And his crusader approach, though often problematic to others, was never to himself. Finally, in biography, you have to deal with your subject's death. One day I arrived at Sumner House, where Bernard spent his last years ruminating about his work and his life. And turning to me, he quietly said, "I am looking into the eye of death." It was the final door of anonymity, the very thing he had resisted as an illegitimate child and state ward, the dread of being invisible. On the evening of the 11th Raka Award, Bernard Smith passed through death's door. But the story doesn't end there, not if you are Bernard Smith. That door opened his Nachleben, abetted by several symposiums, publications, and this biography. As I say towards the end of Hegel's Owl, Bernard had questioned the Antipodean psyche and given it significant cultural form, as much as insistently proclaiming its legitimate place within a globalised world. The ethnographer Greg Denning beautifully encapsulated him as a man who made us look at our own marginality in a positive way. Be Antipodeans, he told us. Bernard Smith was an inescapable presence, a magnificent intellectual who sought hard-earned posterity and a truly well-deserved afterlife. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sheridan. We've got a little bit of time now for some questions. I'm sure some of you have got questions to ask, but I'm going to exercise my speaker's privilege and ask the first question while you queue up a question for yourselves. Can you just talk a bit, Sheridan, you've sort of touched on this. You've mentioned that You had already written on Smith as a sort of a sub-chapter in an earlier book, and then you received the invitation, and I assumed that might have been one of your first sustained meetings with Bernard. Is that right? He urges you to, no holds barred. You've described him as somebody who's interested in unadorned reality. Were there nevertheless, in the process of producing the biography, were there significant times in which your version of Bernard changed? Were there any big surprises or small unsettlings of your view as you were, proceeding through the biography?
I think because he was such a complex character and I had no idea the extent of that complexity when he asked me to write the biography, and as I said, I accepted because I couldn't decline. He was quite a humble man in many ways, but he had kept this most phenomenal archive, perfectly ordered, and as big as Manning Clark's. It really is truly enormous. And that's where I simply had to follow religiously almost 7 days a week, just keeping my head down and filing through his life. I'd spent 3 months, I had 3 months with Bernard while he was still living at home, seeing him for half a day once a week, talking to him, and he'd say, what do you want to know, Sheridan? And I'd ask certain questions, and I'd say, can I look at your library? Because his library was fantastic, and all the books were annotated, and annotated books give you really interesting insight into how his mind and brain is working in engaging with other literature and other scholars. But he was always hovering around me, a bit like, Hegel's owl, sort of sitting on my shoulder, and I thought, I can't really get a good go on. And then after 3 months he had a fall and was hospitalised, and I thought, this is the end of Bernard Smith. And he did start declining rapidly, and he had to go to an aged care home. But in some ways that took the pressure of him off my shoulder, and I was able to really get a move on. But it was his archive. It was a biographer's gift. And I quite frankly don't know how biographers can write biography without a really decent archive, without diaries, without letters. These are precious personal insights into a person's life. And Bernard had that foresight to keep everything. There was only one travel journal, which I suspect he had censored himself, and there were about 8 pages, I suspect, neatly cut out. And I think if you read his Pavan for Another Time, which is the second volume of his autobiography, I suspect it was his meeting with a prostitute in Venice that those pages probably told a lot more than what he included in that book. So that's the only sort of sense I had of self-censoring. I wish he was still around, because there's lots I'd like to ask him now that I've gone through his archive, now that I've written it, and I would have loved to have known what he thought of the biography. He did say to me in the beginning, there's only one thing I ask, Sheridan, is that you read me, because he couldn't read, he had macular degeneration. You read me what you write. I'm only interested in pulling you up where you're really wrong. Otherwise, I won't interfere at all. So I can remember reading him something that I'd written, and he did pull me up. He objected to the word, I'd said his mother had abandoned him. He said, no, she didn't abandon me. She was always going to come back for me. This is after leaving him as a 2-year-old in Burwood with Mrs. Keane. And she did come back 6 years later, but it was decided that he would stay with Mrs. Keane, and it was just as well for him, because he certainly wouldn't have got the education if he'd gone home with his biological mother to the wet cane field district of Innisfail, where they lived in a real humpy. So, but that's the only time he pulled me up. And so I always sort of bore in my mind with certain respect for him. But no, I really didn't come across anything that really threw me. No.
That's great.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
So, yes.
Did he have children? Because
Ye-
he would have been a real influence on them, wouldn't he?
Yes, he had 2 children, Betty and John. It always reminds me of my school reader, Betty and John. I say in the biography that he was something of an absent father. His work, came first, but he was also a caring father. And when they would go out for weekends or through the botanical gardens here in Sydney or up to the Blue Mountains, he would show them how to navigate by the stars, how to boil a billy. It was all about survival, and he was very pragmatic about teaching them. That probably came from him being a school teacher as much as this notion of having to survive himself in what could be a merciless world. Yes, I mean, his son has grievances against him. His daughter adores the very ground he walked on. So, I mean, every family has its problems, I think. But yeah, yes.
What does his children think of the book, your book?
His daughter adores it. She thinks it captures him perfectly and captures his relationship with her mother. And again, the biographer ends up sometimes knowing more about a person's father than a child ever knows about their own parents. So I guess it's a big revelation to them in many ways. His son John is a man of few words, so but I think he also thoroughly endorses it and enjoys it. So, and his granddaughter Kate Chalice has been extremely supportive of the whole process, but is equally moved by it. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes.
Just wondered, did he go up have relationships with the other foster children and the Keens over?
He always stayed in touch with the Keens, even when he grew up and moved away. He wasn't allowed to go to Mrs. Keen's funeral. They sent him away somewhere. And I think he said, even in death, he was an outsider. But when the daughter died, Bertha Keene, he was then, I think, living in Melbourne, and he went back to Sydney for her funeral. And she had stayed a member. No, sorry, I've got this wrong. It was actually another state ward, Vera, I think, who had died, and this other state ward, who he was actually quite good friends with, stayed a Salvation Army person. So he was asked to say a few words. And it was at that point that he decided to start writing his first autobiography. So going back and meeting all these people from when he was a fostered child just opened and triggered off all these memories. And he spent 6 years writing that first volume. And he found it very cathartic as well. Mm.
questions so far have sort of tended to take you down a bit of a personal Bernard Smith direction. So I want to ask you now, what do you think we mightn't know if there hadn't been a Bernard Smith? What do you think, say, some of his greatest sort of intellectual or scholarly contributions have been?
The one area that is unequivocally known and regarded throughout internationally is Bernard Smith's scholarship on the art of Captain Cook's voyages. And he, in the process, became such an authority that it not only established the study of the South Pacific, but as I said, it actually is a study of cultural imperialism that he opens up. And this book, which was published in 1960, is still regarded as a classic. It's still referred to. And in fact, there is talk about it being reprinted, just in a small, paperback sort of. But the text just asks so many important questions about that defining of the Antipodean identity and against the European identity. So you in fact start throwing up a lot of questions that define our cultural inheritance, as much as how we then develop on our own in Australia after colonisation and post-colonisation. So he's really very, very significantly revered, both by American anthropologists as much as European ones. And the other major part of his scholarship is that he taught all his students how to ask the why question, but why? And this, of course, in the 1940s, when he wrote Place, Taste and Tradition, he gave a significant sense of Australian cultural identity at a time when there really wasn't such a fully fleshed out one, because he worked around the politics, the axis of politics, culture, society, the inheritance of philosophy and literature, and the defining of why we are different to the British, and justifying it rather than excusing it. He really wanted Australians to stand confidently and proudly on their own 2 feet and not always defer to the British. He hated anything that subordinated people, and he saw British cultural imperialism as much as American cultural imperialism as a form of coming in and sort of subordinating that which was inherently Australian. And so he fought very hard all of his life to keep saying where one stands matters, who you are matters, why are you like you are? Ask yourself the questions against the other extreme, the other geographical point in the world. I do recommend you trying to get a copy of a number of his books. He writes brilliantly too. He writes beautifully. He writes accessibly. He was an accessible person, an accessible intellectual.
So he had a huge influence on the Power Institute. Well, he was the first director.
Yes, he did look back and said that he thought he had failed. He had 3 things in life which he considered he had failed in. 2 were the appointments of 2 academics, whose names I won't mention. Sorry? You know?
No.
Oh.
I like it. Obviously, they're still around.
Yes, I'm still around. And the other one was his failure of making the Power Institute a really first-rate, internationally recognised institute. And that's why in his very old age he decided to give it one more try, and I talk about this in the biography. He wanted to establish another Institute of Art History, which he drafted a big proposal, and which another academic sort of took up and ran with, and in many ways that was Bernard's great concept, another chance, and always another chance of staying visible, of staying relevant. He hated being pushed back to the margins from where he had always been or resided as a child. But yes, you know, he was in many ways the architect of the Power Institute, and it's probably where it is now because of all of those tensions and appalling fights that he had with the staff members, because it just wasn't a smooth Bernard Smith concept. It was one he had to fight to, and he backed down over the tin sheds. You know, he didn't think that it should be part of the university, but there was enough argument from Donald Brooke and a lot of others that Ma Grounds and people like that said, but you know, hang on, you know, why can't it be? And eventually he saw the light of the day and in the end saw how beneficial it was. So he would argue to the death. He would argue to the death, and then if he was beaten, he'd go away and sulk, and then, but constituted through his brain over and over and over and over until he realised if he was wrong or if he still needed to go back and fight again. So, you know, he was relentless.
So where was he wanting to set up the new institute?
Well, it was established in Melbourne,
Oh, okay.
but a lot of people thought it should be national. Maybe it should go to Canberra. And I'm not quite sure exactly where it sits at the moment, but
It still exists.
it still exists, yes, and it's called the Australian Institute of Art History. So, I mean, that's another form of Bernard's Nachleben, his afterlife, which he should be acknowledged for as the originator of that concept. So he leaves behind him a whole trail of sort of, you know, little or big pieces of his afterlife, in his afterlife.
Well, maybe that's a good place for us to wrap up this evening. I know that Sheridan's urging you to read more of Bernard Smith, but you could do worse than actually read Sheridan on Bernard Smith. Thank you all for coming this evening. Can I ask you to join me in thanking Sheridan?